March 1933. The North Atlantic was not just cold, it was alive. 40-foot waves slammed against the sides of Allied merchant ships as convoy HX-229 clawed its way toward Britain. Steel hulls groaned, propellers churned, engines hammered like giant iron hearts trying to outrun death itself. But speed didn't matter out here, because beneath the black water, the enemy wasn't looking. They were listening. This was the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of World War II, a war fought not with explosions at first, but with sound. German submarines didn't need to see convoys. Their hydrophones could detect them from miles away. Every rotating shaft, every rattling pipe, every cavitating propeller turned an Allied ship into a screaming beacon underwater. To the men aboard, the convoy felt hidden in fog and darkness. To the Germans, it sounded like a marching band. Deep below the surface, inside a steel cylinder known as U-boat U-758, a young hydrophone operator pressed his headphones tight and whispered, "Multiple screws, 40 ships, bearing steady." The commander allowed himself a thin smile. Another convoy found, another ambush forming. Far away in London, Winston Churchill already feared this exact moment. He would later admit the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. Britain depended on these convoys for survival: food, oil, ammunition. Without them, the island would starve. And the Germans knew it. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had built an entire strategy around sound. His wolf packs spread across the Atlantic like hunters in tall grass, waiting to hear their prey before closing in for the kill. The ocean carried noise perfectly. Better than air, better than radio. There was no hiding from it. Or so everyone believed. Because nearly 800 miles away, in the rolling belly of one of those very ships, a 28-year-old cook, a man with no rank, no degree, and no permission to think about naval warfare, was about to notice something that admirals, scientists, and engineers had completely missed. And that small observation would begin to change the fate of the Atlantic.
Thomas Lawson was not supposed to change the war. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't even considered important enough to attend safety briefings. He was the cook. His world was grease, steam, and dented pots that slid across the galley floor every time the ship rolled. While gunners scanned horizons and officers studied charts, Lawson worried about powdered eggs, burnt coffee, and keeping soup from spilling during storms. Yet the engine room fascinated him. Whenever his shift ended, instead of sleeping like the rest of the exhausted crew, Lawson wandered down into the lowest decks of the ship, into the heat, the thunder, and the violent shaking of machinery driving the Liberty ship forward. It was unbearable down there, deafening, suffocating, alive. The engineers thought he was crazy. "Cook's lost his mind," one of them muttered. "No one comes down here unless they have to." But Lawson wasn't listening to the noise. He was studying it. He began noticing patterns, how the vibration changed with speed, how the hull trembled differently in calm seas versus storms, how the sound seemed to travel through the steel itself, like the entire ship was one giant instrument. Then one night, during a U-boat attack, something happened that stuck with him. A torpedo struck another merchant ship in the convoy. The explosion echoed through the water. Men rushed to battle stations. The dying vessel began to list as seawater flooded its compartments. Lawson froze, because amid the chaos, he realized something deeply strange. The sound stopped. Not the explosion, not the shouting. The mechanical noise, the deep, constant vibration he'd been feeling for weeks, vanished from that ship as it filled with water. It didn't fade, it disappeared, as if the ocean itself had swallowed the sound. Lawson stood there, staring at the black water where the ship had been, his mind racing. If flooding silenced the machinery, then maybe water didn't just drown ships. Maybe it could hide them.
The thought refused to leave him. For days, Lawson replayed the moment in his head while chopping vegetables, scrubbing pans, and trying to sleep in a bunk that never stopped swaying. Water had silenced the sinking ship, not destroyed the noise, absorbed it. He began sketching ideas on scrap paper meant for kitchen inventories, crude drawings of engine mounts surrounded by sealed compartments, chambers filled with seawater placed between vibrating machinery and the ship's hull, not flooding the ship, using water like insulation, a barrier. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Sound traveled easily through rigid steel, but water, dense, shifting, heavy, could scatter those vibrations before they ever escaped into the ocean. If you could trap the vibration inside the ship, U-boats might never hear it. Lawson showed the drawings to the chief engineer. The man stared at them for a long time, then burst out laughing. "You're suggesting we deliberately put water inside the ship? That's called sinking, son." Others reacted the same way. Officers waved him off, shipmates mocked him relentlessly. The cook's going to redesign naval engineering between breakfast and lunch. But Lawson wasn't trying to redesign ships. He was trying to change what they sounded like. When the convoy finally reached Liverpool after another brutal crossing, one that left multiple ships at the bottom of the Atlantic, Lawson made a decision that could have ended his career on the spot. He went ashore, and instead of heading to a pub like every other exhausted sailor, he walked straight into a restricted Royal Navy headquarters, uninvited, unqualified, and determined to tell them they were fighting the wrong battle. The headquarters at Liverpool's Western Approaches Command was the nerve center of the Atlantic War, a place where maps covered entire walls and every pin marked another ship lost. Civilians did not walk in. Cooks definitely did not walk in. Lawson barely made it past the front desk before being grabbed by shore patrol. "You can't be here," one of them snapped. "This is a restricted facility." "I need to talk to someone about convoy noise," Lawson insisted, trying to explain while they dragged him toward the exit. "You're fighting the wrong problem." Most days, that would have been the end of it. But this was March 1943, the worst month of the Atlantic campaign. Convoys were being slaughtered, escorts were overwhelmed, commanders were desperate for anything that might change the balance. One officer overheard the commotion and told the patrol to stop. Commander Peter Gretton had spent months watching ships under his protection get torpedoed one by one. He had buried too many sailors already. He was in no mood for nonsense, but he was even less willing to ignore a possibility. "What's this about noise?" he asked sharply. Lawson explained, quickly, awkwardly, using words like vibration, water absorption, and acoustic shielding, terms he barely knew how to pronounce. To most listeners, it sounded absurd. To Gretton, it sounded different. Not polished, not theoretical, observed. "Show me," the commander said. Within hours, Lawson found himself inside a dry dock, staring at a damaged escort vessel undergoing repairs. No approval had been granted, no formal test authorized. What they were about to attempt wasn't in any manual. It was improvised wartime experimentation, the kind born only when defeat feels closer than victory. Using scrap metal, spare tanks, and whatever welding equipment they could find, the crew constructed crude sealed chambers around sections of the propulsion system. They filled them with seawater, essentially wrapping parts of the ship's machinery in liquid. It looked ridiculous, like plumbing had invaded the engine room. But if Lawson was right, it might make the ship quieter than any warship had ever been. 3 days later, they took the vessel out for a test, and everyone aboard understood the risk. If this failed, nothing else remained to try.
The modified escort ship moved slowly out of Liverpool Harbor under a gray, wind-cut sky. There was no ceremony, no official observers, just a handful of skeptical officers, a confused crew, and one very nervous cook standing on deck. Several hundred yards away, a British submarine waited beneath the surface. Its hydrophone operators had one simple task: listen. If they could still hear the ship clearly, the experiment was over. Engines increased to cruising speed. Inside the vessel, everything felt the same: the vibration, the motion, the familiar mechanical pulse. To the crew, nothing seemed different at all. But underwater was what mattered. Minutes passed, then more minutes. No signal came from the submarine. Finally, the sub surfaced. A signal lamp blinked across the water. Lost contact. At first, no one reacted. They assumed it was a mistake. The test was repeated. Again, the escort ship ran its engines harder. Again, the submarine listened. Again, silence. The hydrophone crew reported they could detect the ship only at extremely short range. Beyond that, its sound blended into the background noise of the ocean itself. It hadn't vanished. It had become indistinguishable. The realization hit the officers all at once. U-boats didn't need ships to be silent. They only needed to lose them in the noise. Lawson's crude water-filled chambers weren't muting the machinery completely. They were scrambling the vibrations before they escaped the hull, breaking up the clean acoustic signature German submarines depended on. The ocean was no longer carrying the convoy's voice. It was swallowing it. Within days, word reached senior command, and the reaction was immediate: disbelief, argument, then urgency. Because if the results held true in combat conditions, the Allies might finally have a way to cross the Atlantic without announcing their arrival to every submarine within range. Testing in harbor was one thing. Testing in the open Atlantic, where German wolf packs hunted relentlessly, was another. A small number of merchant ships were quietly selected for modification. No announcement was made to the crews beyond what was necessary. To most sailors, the added tanks and strange fittings looked like yet another piece of wartime improvisation. Within 48 hours per vessel, dock workers installed the water-filled chambers around propulsion shafts and key vibration points. It required no redesign, no advanced technology, just steel, seawater, and hard labor. Soon after, the convoy sailed. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The ship still formed columns, escorts still zigzagged, lookouts still scanned gray horizons for periscopes and torpedo wakes. But beneath the surface, the acoustic picture was completely different. German submarines spread across the convoy's path detected something confusing. Their hydrophones picked up fragments, some ships loud and clear, others fading in and out, as if the formation itself were broken. Commanders hesitated. They could not form a precise attack pattern if they couldn't track the entire convoy. Some submarines moved closer to regain contact, and that was exactly what the escorts wanted. Because now, instead of striking from a safe listening distance, the U-boats had to approach into radar range, into sonar range, into danger. For the first time in months, the hunters were being forced to expose themselves. The convoy still took losses. The Atlantic was never forgiving, but the modified ships passed through untouched, their presence masked by the sea itself. Reports from escort commanders describe the effect in simple terms: the enemy cannot hear us until we are already on top of them. That single change began unraveling the carefully coordinated wolfpack tactics Germany had relied upon since the start of the war. By May 1943, something strange was happening across the Atlantic. German U-boat commanders began reporting unreliable detections. Convoys that should have been audible from great distances were suddenly difficult to track. Some ships seemed to vanish entirely from hydrophone contact, only to reappear visually at close range, far closer than was safe. Wolfpack coordination started to break down. Submarines that once attacked in synchronized waves now struggled to locate one another's targets.
They were forced to surface more often, maneuver more aggressively, and close distances they had previously avoided. And every time they did, Allied escorts were waiting. Radar picked them up, sonar locked on, depth charges followed. The month became known among German crews as Black May, a period when U-boat losses spiked dramatically, shocking a force that had once dominated the Atlantic. What had changed wasn't just technology, it was information. The submarines had lost their greatest advantage, the ability to hear before being seen. Instead of ambushing convoys from afar, they were now stumbling into defended formations that knew exactly where to look. Across Allied Naval Command, analysts noticed the shift. Shipping losses began to drop. Escort success rates rose. Convoys that would once have been decimated were suddenly surviving the crossing. No single innovation won the Atlantic War. Radar, air cover, improved tactics all played critical roles, but among them was this unlikely contribution: a simple method of using water itself to confuse the physics of sound, a solution born not in a laboratory, but in a ship's galley.
By late 1943, the tide in the Atlantic had unmistakably turned. Convoys were still attacked, ships were still lost, but the catastrophic slaughter of early 1943 never returned with the same intensity. Allied production surged, escorts grew more capable, and U-boat commanders found themselves fighting a battle that was no longer predictable. Many factors contributed to this reversal: improved radar, long-range aircraft, intelligence breakthroughs, and new escort strategies. Yet hidden among these advances was a modest mechanical adaptation that required no revolutionary machinery. It simply changed how ships interacted with the ocean. After the war, naval engineers refined the principle into more sophisticated acoustic masking systems. Variations of the concept, using fluids or bubbles to disrupt sound transmission, became standard features in later naval design, evolving alongside Cold War anti-submarine technology. As for Thomas Lawson, he never became famous. He returned home, opened a small restaurant, raised a family, and spoke little about the war. Those who met him saw only a former merchant seaman who had done his part like millions of others. There were no grand interviews, no memoirs, no attempt to claim credit. Yet among some naval officers, his story endured as a reminder that innovation in wartime doesn't always arrive through rank, authority, or formal training. Sometimes it comes from observation, from curiosity, from someone willing to question why things are done a certain way, even when everyone else assumes the answer is already known. And in the vast, violent theater of World War II, where massive fleets and industrial might often defined victory, it was one quiet insight about sound and water that helped tilt the balance, not by making ships stronger, but by making them harder to hear.